It started with a door I forgot to knock on. It was late, well past 11 p.m. The house was silent, except for the hum of the central air. I'd been heading upstairs to bed, carrying a basket of folded towels, when I noticed light spilling out from the half-open bathroom door. I assumed Cole, my stepson, had left it on by mistake. He's always been careless like that, a bit scatterbrained forever, leaving lights on dishes in the sink and his laundry in piles. But when I pushed the door open, ready to call him out for wasting electricity, I froze. He was there, sitting on the edge of the tub, shirtless, his sweatpants pushed down around his thighs. The water was running, steaming up the mirrors, but he wasn't bathing. His hand was gripping himself. His face turned toward the ceiling, eyes half closed for a moment. I couldn't breathe. My first instinct was to slam the door and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But my body betrayed me. I stood there, routed to the spot, watching as if I couldn't quite process what was happening. He didn't notice me at first, the soft groan slipping from his lips, the slow rhythm of his hand. He was completely lost in his own world. And then he saw me. His head snapped toward the doorway, his eyes locking onto mine. In a split second of stunned silence, he stammered, scrambling to cover himself with a towel. His face turned crimson, his voice thick with embarrassment. "Sorry," I blurted, spinning around so fast I nearly dropped the towels. My heart was hammering as I fled down the hallway, leaving the door ajar behind me. I didn't stop until I was in my bedroom, the basket forgotten on the floor. My hands were shaking as I sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing pulse. But I couldn't get the image out of my head, the flush of his skin, the sheer vulnerability of the moment. I told myself it was nothing. Just an awkward situation, a fluke, but even as I tried to push it from my mind, I felt a warmth spreading through me, something dark and unfamiliar. And that was the beginning. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it, or at least exaggerated it in my mind. Maybe it hadn't been as intense as I remembered. Maybe I'd only caught the briefest glimpse, and my tired brain filled in the rest. That's what I told myself as I fixed my hair in the bathroom mirror, brushing through the streaks of grey. That I'd stopped dying last year. Walter had already left for work. He always left early, sometimes before the sun even came up. Another big meeting or urgent deal that couldn't wait. I didn't mind his absence, not really after nearly 12 years of marriage. The spark between us had dimmed to a faint flicker. We didn't fight, but we didn't talk much either. We'd settled into a routine, polite conversations over dinner, the occasional movie on the couch. Separate bedrooms most nights. Cole had moved back in a few months ago, shortly after finishing college. He wasn't like Walter, where my husband was all sharp suits and stern expressions. Cole was relaxed, casual, almost boyish in his charm. He had a lazy confidence about him, the kind that came from knowing you were good-looking and charismatic. He was tall, lean, but muscular, with sandy, blonde hair that always looked like he just rolled out of bed. When I came downstairs, he was already in the kitchen, standing at the counter in nothing but a pair of gym shorts. He was pouring a cup of coffee, the sunlight streaming through the window, highlighting the defined lines of his back and shoulders. I hesitated for a moment, then cleared my throat as if I hadn't just been admiring him. "Morning," he said, without turning around. "Morning." I replied, keeping my tone casual, as I grabbed a mug from the cabinet. He turned to face me, leaning against the counter, with a cocky smirk that made me instantly suspicious. "Sleep well," his tone was light, but there was something in the way he looked at me, like he knew I hadn't my stomach twisted, but I forced a smile. "Fine. Thanks you," he shrugged. "Yeah, didn't think I'd see you last night, though." The coffee pot sputtered, breaking the silence that followed. My cheeks burned and I turned away, busying myself with sugar and cream. He wasn't saying it outright, but he didn't have to. We both knew what he meant. "I didn't mean to walk in," I said finally. my voice quieter than I intended. "It was an accident." "Don't worry about it," he said, his smirk softening into something gentler. "It's not a big deal, but it was a big deal." At least it felt like one to me. That afternoon, I went to the gallery to distract myself. It was a small place tucked into a corner of downtown, filled with overpriced paintings and sculptures that only a handful of regular clients could afford. I spent most of my shift rearranging displays and chatting with the occasional customer, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Cole. It wasn't just what I'd seen. It was the way he'd looked at me this morning, like he was testing me, waiting to see how I'd react. It unsettled me, but it also intrigued me. When I got home, Walter's car was gone. As usual, Cole was in the living room, sprawled out on the couch, with the TV on and his feet propped up on the coffee table. He looked up when I walked in, his face breaking into an easy smile. "Hey, Viv," he said. He'd taken to calling me by my first name lately. At first it had bothered me. There was something too familiar about it. But now I found that I didn't mind. "Hey," I said, kicking off my shoes and setting my bag down. "What are you watching, some stupid action movie?" He said with a shrug, "Nothing you'd like." I sat down in the armchair across from him, more out of habit than anything else. I wasn't really paying attention to the TV. My eyes kept drifting to him instead. The way his t-shirt clung to his chest, the slight stubble on his jawline. He looked comfortable, relaxed, like he belonged here in a way I never quite had. "Long day?" he asked, glancing over at me. "Not really." I said, "Just quiet." "You should have stayed home," he said, his tone teasing. "I could have kept you company." I laughed, but there was an edge to his words that I couldn't ignore. I told myself I was imagining it, reading too much into an innocent comment. But then he shifted, turning toward me so that our eyes met. His expression was unreadable. There was an intensity in his gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're tense," he said. "You should relax more." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look away. "Maybe I will over the next few days." I started noticing things I hadn't before, or maybe things I'd been deliberately ignoring. The way Cole's hand would linger on my shoulder a moment too long when he passed me in the kitchen. The way his eyes followed me when I walked into a room. The way he leaned in just a little too close when we talked. And it wasn't just him. I caught myself watching him too, stealing glances when I thought he wasn't looking, letting my mind wander to places it shouldn't. It wasn't just about what I'd seen in the bathroom. It was the way he made me feel alive, desired, like I was more than just Walter's wife, or the woman who kept the house running. I told myself it was harmless, just a little crush, a passing fascination. But deep down I knew better. One evening I was in the kitchen, finishing up the dishes when Cole came in behind me. I didn't hear him at first, and when I turned around he was so close that I almost bumped into him. "Sorry," he said. "But he didn't move back. It's fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt charged, heavy with something unsaid. His eyes flicked down to my lips, then back up to meet my gaze. I should have stepped away. I should have said something, anything to break the tension. But I didn't, and in that moment, I realized there was no turning back. The line wasn't crossed in one grand, dramatic moment. It was a slow, deliberate unraveling, like pulling at the thread of a tightly wound sweater, until it falls apart. Every glance, every touch, every word exchanged between us tugged at that thread, leaving me breathless and exposed. It started small, almost innocuous. Cole began lingering longer in the kitchen when I was there. He'd lean against the counter watching me cook, his eyes drifting down my body in a way that was anything but casual. I tried to ignore it, but I could feel his gaze like a heat radiating through me. One evening, Walter was out of town again. Some business conference in Chicago. I poured myself a glass of wine and was sitting on the back patio, letting the evening breeze cool my flushed skin. Cole stepped outside barefoot and shirtless, his gym shorts slung low on his hips. He carried a beer in one hand and a cocky grin on his face. "You're out here all by yourself?" he asked, taking a seat in the chair beside me. "Just enjoying the quiet," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "Mind if I join you?" I shook my head. Though I knew I should have said yes. His presence was dangerous, intoxicating. But I couldn't bring myself to send him away. We sat in silence for a while, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. The cicadas hummed in the background, a soft, rhythmic soundtrack to my racing thoughts. "You don't talk much about yourself?" he said, suddenly breaking the silence. I glanced at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Just you're always taking care of everyone else, Walter. This house, everything. But I don't think I've ever heard you talk about what you want." The question caught me off guard. What did I want? I'd spent so many years putting everyone else first that I wasn't sure I knew the answer anymore. "I don't know," I said finally. "I guess I don't think about it much." "You should," he said, his voice low and serious. "You deserve to have something for yourself." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment I forgot about all the reasons this was wrong. He wasn't just my stepson. He was a man, a young, confident, undeniably attractive man who made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. The first kiss happened a week later. Walter had left for an early morning meeting, and Cole and I were alone in the kitchen. I was standing by the sink, rinsing off the breakfast dishes, when I felt him behind me. He didn't touch me, but I could feel his presence. The warmth of his body just inches from mine. "You're too good at this," he said, his voice soft and teasing at what I asked. Turning my head slightly, taking care of everyone, cleaning up after us, being perfect all the time. I laughed, though it came out shaky. "Someone has to—" He reached out, then, his fingers brushing against my wrist. As I set a plate on the drying rack, I froze, my breath catching in my throat slowly. I turned to face him, and suddenly the space between us felt unbearably small. His eyes searched mine as if waiting for permission, and I hated how badly I wanted to give it. "This is wrong," I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. "I don't care," he said, and then he kissed me. His lips were warm and insistent, his hands gripping my waist as he pulled me closer. I should have pushed him away, but instead I melted into him, my fingers tangling in his hair. The kiss was desperate, hungry, years of longing and frustration pouring out all at once. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard. His forehead rested against mine, his hands still on my waist. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't. That night marked the beginning of something I couldn't control. We were careful, at first stealing kisses in the shadows of the house, touching each other only when we were sure we wouldn't be caught. But the secrecy only made it more thrilling. Every brush of his hand, every stolen moment, felt like a forbidden indulgence I couldn't get enough of. It wasn't long before we stopped holding back. One evening, after Walter had gone to bed early, Cole found me in the laundry room. I was folding towels, my back to the door, when I felt his arms wrap around my waist. I gasped, my hands freezing, mid-fold, as he pressed his lips to the curve of my neck. "Cole," I whispered, but there was no protest in my voice. "I've been thinking about you all day," he murmured, his breath hot against my skin. My resolve crumbled, as it always did around him. I turned in his arms, letting him kiss me, his hands sliding under my shirt to caress my bare skin. The laundry room was cramped and poorly lit, but in that moment it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way he made me feel, wanted, alive, reckless. We didn't just confine ourselves to the house. One afternoon, he convinced me to meet him at the art gallery after hours. I hesitated at first, knowing how risky it was, but the thought of being alone with him somewhere other than home was too tempting to resist. The gallery was dimly lit, the faint glow of the security lights casting long shadows on the walls. He was waiting for me by the back entrance, his expression unreadable. "You sure about this?" I asked as I stepped inside. He didn't answer instead. He took my hand and led me to the small office in the back. The door clicked shut behind us, and suddenly we were on each other. His lips on mine, his hands sliding under my dress. The thrill of being in such a public place, of knowing we could be caught at any moment, only heightened the intensity of it afterward. As we lay tangled together on the small office couch, I traced lazy circles on his chest and tried not to think about the consequences of what we'd just done. As the days turned into weeks, the affair consumed us. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word felt like adding fuel to a fire that neither of us wanted to put out. I told myself it was just physical, a way to fill the emptiness that had been growing inside me for years. But deep down I knew it was more than that. It wasn't just about the way he touched me or the way he made me feel. It was the way he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. It was the way he listened when I talked, the way he made me laugh, the way he reminded me of the person I used to be before life had worn me down. But even as I let myself fall deeper into him, a part of me knew it couldn't last. Secrets like ours never stayed hidden for long. And the more reckless we became, the closer we came to being caught. The fire we'd started was growing out of control. It wasn't just the way Cole would steal a kiss when no one was looking, or the way I'd sneak into his room late at night when Walter was snoring down the hall. It was the constant craving, the way my thoughts drifted to him when I should have been focusing on work, the way his texts would light up my phone and send a thrill through me, even in the middle of a conversation with someone else. We were bold, almost reckless. The secrecy made it electric. But the more we gave in to our desires, the less careful we became. One night, while Walter was away on a 3-day business trip, Cole and I ventured to the guest house behind the property. It was an old space, mostly used for storage now, but it had once been a cozy retreat, complete with a kitchenette, a small living area, and a bed that hadn't been slept in for years. He led me there after dinner, his hand tugging mine, with that confident smile he always wore when he wanted something. "No one will bother us here," he said as we stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and aged wood, but neither of us cared the second the door closed. He had me pressed against it, his lips devouring mine, his hands sliding under the hem of my blouse. "I've been thinking about this all day," he murmured, his voice low and husky. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My breath hitched as he pushed me toward the bed, his movements urgent but deliberate, his lips trailing down my neck. There was something intoxicating about being in a place so close to home, yet completely removed from it. The bed creaked under our weight, the dim light from the single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. For a moment it felt like we were the only two people in the world, but the world had a way of creeping back in. The next morning, as I was walking back to the main house, I saw Elaine, our nosy neighbor, standing on the edge of her property with a watering can in hand. She waved her smile, overly friendly, but there was something in her eyes that made my stomach twist. "Good morning, Vivian," she called out. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. Didn't know anyone still used the guest house. She said, her tone light but probing. Thought it was just collecting dust these days. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer. Then she turned back to her flowers, humming softly to herself. I walked inside, my heart pounding. Had she seen us? Was she just fishing for information? Either way, the encounter left me rattled. Elaine wasn't the only problem. The gallery was hosting a small private event one evening, and I'd been busy all day preparing for it. By the time the guests began arriving, I was running on autopilot, greeting clients and making small talk, while my thoughts remained elsewhere. And then Cole showed up. I hadn't invited him, of course, but there he was, leaning casually against the bar, in a crisp button-down shirt that made him look older than his years. When our eyes met across the room, my heart skipped a beat. "What are you doing here?" I hissed when I managed to pull him aside. "I wanted to see you," he said, his voice low and playful. "You're always busy here, so I figured I'd come to you." "This isn't the time," I said, glancing around nervously. "Relax," he said, his hand brushing against mine, in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "No one knows anything." But I wasn't so sure. I could feel Elaine's eyes on me, and I swore I saw her whispering to another guest, while glancing in our direction. Later that night, after the event had ended and the guests had gone, Cole stayed behind to help me clean up. The tension between us was palpable, and it wasn't long before we were tangled together in the small storage room, his hands lifting my skirt as my back pressed against the shelves. It was thrilling, forbidden, and utterly reckless. The more time we spent together, the more possessive Cole became. It started with little things. He'd ask who I was texting or why I hadn't answered his calls. At first I thought it was sweet, a sign that he cared, but as the weeks went on, his jealousy became harder to ignore. One evening, I came home from the gallery to find him waiting for me in the living room. Walter was still at work as usual, and the house was eerily quiet. "Who's Adam?" he asked, holding up my phone. "What?" I asked, confused. "You got a text from someone named Adam," he said, his tone accusatory. "Who is he?" I snatched the phone from his hand, my annoyance flaring. "He's a client. We were discussing a painting he wants to buy." "That's it." He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight, then he nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "I don't like the idea of other men texting you," he said finally. His words sent a chill through me, but I brushed it off. "You're being ridiculous," I said, walking past him toward the kitchen. But his jealousy didn't stop there. Things took a darker turn one afternoon when Walter's secretary, Clara, came by the house unexpectedly. She was dropping off some documents for Walter, who was in the middle of a conference call. I invited her in, offering her a glass of water. While she waited, Cole walked into the room, his expression darkening when he saw sitting at the kitchen table. "Who's this?" he asked, his tone sharp. "This is Clara," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Walter's secretary." He didn't respond, but the tension in the room was palpable. Clara seemed oblivious, chatting politely, while Cole stood there. His jaw clenched, his eyes never leaving her. After she left, he turned to me, his voice low and angry. "I don't trust her." "Cole, she's just doing her job," I said, exasperated. "She's always here when Walter's not." He said, "Doesn't that seem suspicious to you?" I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I'd had my suspicions about Clara for months. Walter was careful, but I wasn't blind. The cracks in our arrangement were beginning to show. Cole's possessiveness was becoming harder to ignore, and Walter's increasingly secretive behavior only added to the strain. I was caught in the middle, trying to balance a web of lies that was growing more tangled by the day. And then Elaine dropped the bombshell. She came to the house one afternoon holding a manila envelope. Her smile was tight, her eyes cold as she handed it to me. "You might want to take a look at this," she said before walking away. Inside the envelope were photos, grainy, poorly lit but unmistakable. Me and Cole in the guest house, in the gallery, in his bedroom. My stomach dropped. Elaine had seen everything, and now she held all the cards. The manila envelope sat on the kitchen counter, a ticking time bomb. My hands trembled as I sifted through the photos, my stomach twisting tighter with each one. Elaine's shadowy figure must have been lurking for weeks, snapping these at just the right moment. The last photo was the worst. Taken through the guest house window, it showed me sitting on the bed, Cole leaning over me, his face buried in my neck. There was no denying what was happening. I felt the room spin as Elaine's smug face replayed in my mind. Her final words echoed, "We all have secrets, Vivian, but some secrets are more expensive than others." Elaine's terms came the next morning. She cornered me in the driveway as I was leaving for the gallery. holding a cup of coffee and a sickly, sweet smile. "You're going to sell me that Cranston painting," she said, cutting straight to the point. My stomach lurched. The Cranston was the gallery's centerpiece, a prized six-figure abstract piece I'd curated for months to bring in the wealthiest clientele. "Elaine, I can't just—" "You can," she interrupted. Her smile widened, showing too many teeth. "You will, because if you don't, Walter and the entire town will see what you've been up to with that stepson of yours. And let's face it, Vivian, you're not exactly the forgiving type." She had me. There was no point arguing. If Walter found out, I'd lose everything. The house, my marriage, my already fragile reputation. And worse, Cole's life would be ruined before it even begun. "Fine," I said, my voice hollow. "I'll arrange the sale." "Good girl," she said, patting my shoulder like a condescending teacher. I clenched my fists as she walked away, my chest burning with humiliation and rage. That evening, the blackmail was still gnawing at me. As I poured myself a second glass of wine, Walter was in his office upstairs, his phone glued to his ear as usual. But this time, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Elaine wasn't wrong. Walter's late nights and urgent business trips had started long before Cole and I had crossed any lines. Fueled by desperation and anger, I crept upstairs to his office, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. His briefcase sat open on the desk, a stack of papers neatly organized inside. But it wasn't the papers that caught my attention. It was his phone buzzing with a message from Clara. "Can't stop thinking about last night. See you tomorrow." My hand tightened around the edge of the desk as bile rose in my throat. So it was true, Walter wasn't just neglectful. He was a liar. The knowledge should have made me feel justified, vindicated even, but instead it left me cold. I couldn't think about it now, not with Alain's threats hanging over my head, and Cole waiting for me downstairs. The boiling point came 2 nights later. I'd stayed late at the gallery, finalizing the paperwork to sell the Cranston to Alain for a fraction of its worth. When I arrived home, I found Cole pacing in the kitchen, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. "Where were you?" he demanded. As I set down my bag at work, I said, too exhausted to match his intensity. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" He snapped. "Elaine just stopped by." My blood ran cold. "What did she say?" She asked a lot of questions. He said, his voice rising. "About the guest house, about us." "She knows, doesn't she?" "Keep your voice down," I hissed, glancing toward the stairs. "Vivian, answer me," he shouted before I could respond. Walter appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and irritation. "What the hell is going on here?" Cole froze, his anger replaced by panic. I stepped between them, trying to keep my voice calm. "Nothing, Walter. Cole's just upset about something at work." "Don't lie to me," Walter said, his voice icy. "I've been suspicious for weeks the way you two act around each other." "What are you hiding?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Cole beat me to it. "Why don't you ask Clara?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. Walter's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "What did you just say? You heard me?" Cole said, stepping closer. "You're not exactly innocent in all this, are you?" The room crackled with tension, Walter's anger rising to match Cole's. And then it happened. Walter lunged forward, shoving Cole back against the counter. "You little bastard, stop it!" I screamed, grabbing Walter's arm. But it was too late. Cole pushed back harder than he intended, and Walter stumbled. His foot caught on the edge of the rug, and he fell backward, his head striking the edge of the counter with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything went still. Walter lay crumpled on the floor, blood pooling beneath his head. Cole stared at him in horror, his chest heaving. "Oh, my God," I whispered, dropping to my knees beside Walter. He's breathing," Cole said, his voice shaky. "Call 911. I said, my hands trembling as I pressed a towel to Walter's head.